Hi, I'm Sam London, Board Game Geeks and other horror fan and designer of Firefight Tactical. I want to put this video together to do a rules overview of Firefight Tactical and give you a better sense of how the game plays. I'm not going to cover all of the rules in this video. Instead, I'm going to focus on what are the rules that you would need to understand to get through your first several turns of the game, and that should give you a really good idea of the flow of the game and how it plays. So the first thing I want to cover is components. The most important component in Firefight Tactical is the unit counters. So, if you look at the unit counters at the top left, you have the name of the unit. This is an assault squad. And then beneath that, you actually have, I should mention this time, you have the number of soldiers that are shown on that counter. That's relevant because it tells you whether it is a full squad, this is a full squad, or in the case over here where it's only 2, that's a half squad, or in the case of our leader, Sergeant Hardy over here, that is a single man counter. But we'll come back to that later. Back to our assault squad, beneath the number of soldiers that tells us this is a full squad, we have our dice menu. And so this tells you all of the actions that can be performed with this unit if the corresponding die is assigned to it. So this unit can fire if a 4 or a 5 is assigned to it. Because the die symbol is not colored, that means any die color, so long as it's a 4 or a 5, can be assigned to this assault squad to fire with it. Conversely, if you look at the ability to pop smoke down there, a 2 or a 3 must be assigned to it, and that 2 or 3 must be either a green or a red die. And then finally, you can see with the assault action, this assault squad can assault with any red die, or any 3 or 4, but any red die, regardless of pips, you would be able to assault with this assault squad. Besides that, we go over to the right, and you can see under the star, the unit's morale is a 7. Beneath that is its fire profile. It has an 8 firepower, and a maximum range of 3 is the furthest that it can exert that firepower. And then beneath that is its movement factor, which is 3 maximum movement points when it is activated. Oh, on the flip side of our infantry, we have their pinned versions. You can see that the pinned versions have lower stats generally, and also that they have a rally and rout action. They'll all have a rally and rout action, but the point is they have a different dice menu on the backside. Next thing to look at is our terrain cards. So some terrain cards, like this house, have a special ability associated with it, but what they all have is this stat profile on the bottom. So the first thing we have is the impact of the terrain card on visibility. This is only relevant when you are tracing line of sight through one of these terrain cards. I'll come back to those though. Next is the cost in movement points for infantry to move into the terrain card. The next one is the same thing but for vehicles. And then finally we have our terrain effect modifier. So let's go back to visibility. If we look at this road, it has this open eyeball. That means that this is open terrain. And so if we were to have a unit in this house firing on units in this other house, because they are tracing line of sight through this and it's an open eyeball, this road does nothing to line of sight. It is completely irrelevant. This house, though, with the single slash through the eye, this is hindering terrain. And so if we were to, as an example, have a unit in this orchard that was attempting to fire on a unit in this road, the line of sight is passing through this house. So while the road itself has no impact on the shot, because it has a +0 terrain effect modifier, this +2 would affect the shot because it's hindering terrain and line of sight is passing through it. The third type, let's actually flip this real quick, is obstructing terrain in the case of these woods. So if we had a unit in this orchard that was attempting to fire on a unit in this road, it would not be able to because line of sight cannot pass through obstructing terrain. So that is it for our terrain cards. And then the last important component is our dice. So first we have our larger dice that we use for, you always roll 2 dice when you're resolving actions. But these impulse dice are what drive the game. They come in 4 colors: white, red, green, and blue. White are general, red are generally around more aggressive actions, green about more mobile actions, and blue around more command-based actions. They can exist in one of 3 spaces. Well, 4 if you include having been assigned to a unit. One is the common pool. Both players draft from the common pool. There is the private reserve. Each player has access to a private reserve that is only they can draft from. And then finally is the game timer. So the game timer, at the end of each game turn, we take a die off of the game timer and we add it to the common pool. So the number of dice in the common pool for drafting is always increasing as the game goes on. So that's about it for our component overview. Let's get into game and scenario setup. So the first thing you do when playing Firefight Tactical is you pick a scenario. The scenario will tell you these are the dice for the common pool, the private reserves, and the timer. And then it will tell you how to construct the scenario with the terrain deck. So when you're constructing the terrain deck, really the battle grid for Firefight Tactical, you're going to be told about 3 different types of terrain cards. The first is fixed terrain. So just to give you an idea of what's going on in this scenario, we have our Americans coming in here, and they are attempting to occupy one or both of these farmhouses, which at the beginning of the scenario will be occupied by the German defenders. Now, the cards that are in a given zone, I guess you could call it a slot, in this battle grid will change over the course of play for a variety of reasons, such as lateral movement, scouting, these kind of things. And what terrain card is in a zone is always considered what is the most tactically relevant terrain within that zone at the time. Fixed terrain is the exception to that, in that fixed terrain can never change over the course of the scenario. In other words, these 2 farmhouses, because they are the objectives, are always the most tactically relevant thing in these slots, so they will never change. Besides fixed terrain, though, we also get starting terrain. In this scenario, it's this long road and this orchard. Our starting terrain essentially means this is terrain that is tactically relevant, that both sides are aware of at the start of the scenario. They can be changed out, though, over the course of play. The remaining cards that you are told to put together when you are building a scenario is going to end up in this terrain deck. The terrain deck gets shuffled, and then the cards will be dealt out to the remaining slots in the battle grid. These face-down terrain cards represent fog of war. Then, the last thing that will happen is recon. Each scenario notes recon for each side, and that represents each side's knowledge of the terrain that is unique to them at the start of the scenario. So, as the American player, the recon in the scenario is these 3 cards. For the German, it's these 3 cards. And so I would be able to look at each of these and have a better idea of how I want to launch my initial assault based on these cards. And the German would be able to do the same thing with their defense based on their knowledge of these cards. The last part of setup is just what units you have available. It'll tell you who gets what units, if there's reinforcements or anything during any turn of the game. It'll tell you when they come in, and you can set them aside. So that's about it for setup. Let's get into the actual turn structure. So the first thing that happens in any turn of Firefight Tactical is we roll all of our dice pools. So we would roll our common pool, and we would roll our private reserves. And what we're looking for is any 6s. 6s are always immediately discarded from play. They will have the chance to come back into play at the start of the next game turn, but all 6s are immediately discarded. This makes it so you never know exactly how many impulses are going to be in a given game turn, and you also never know for sure how many dice of a given color are going to be available in a given game turn. After that's been done, we have it where the first player, the initiative player, which is defined by the scenario, in the scenario the initiative player is always the American player, will choose to take either a die from the common pool or from their private reserve and assign it to any of their units that does not already have a die on it and perform the corresponding action with that unit, a corresponding action. So I should clarify that. If I was to assign a 3 to this assault squad, say it's a white 3, I would either resolve the assault action or the take cover action. I would not do both. So you do have to choose. So then I would perform the action with that unit. Let's move him in here. And then it's my opponent's turn to draft a die, again from the common pool or from their own reserve. Once your reserve is depleted, nothing happens. You no longer have dice in your private reserve to draft. However, as soon as the last die is drafted from the common pool, that is the end of that game turn. We would go through a bit of cleanup, melee resolves at that point, and then all of the dice come back off of our unit and back to our common pool or our private reserve. We would take a die from the game timer, and we would roll all of them again, removing the 6s, and that would be the start of the next game turn. That's the flow of play. The only thing that disrupts flow of play is opportunity fire. So I'm going to come back to this, but during movement, any action that results in movement for a unit, your opponent has the opportunity to interrupt your turn to pull a die that corresponds to a fire action and attempt opportunity fire on the moving unit. So long as that unit does not become pinned or eliminated as a result of that opportunity fire, they would then be able to continue their move action at that point. That's the only thing that disrupts that flow of play that I just laid out. So that is it for our turn sequence. Now at this point, I think it's time to get into the actions themselves. So again, I'm not going to cover all of the actions, but I'm going to cover the core ones and how they work. So the first, most fundamental action is movement. So if I was to assign one to this assault squad, first off, in this scenario, I should cover these units are entering from off board, which means that this staging area is adjacent to all 4 of these cards, so they can move into any of them. Then I would move into however many terrain cards I wish, one at a time, subtracting the cost on that terrain card from the movement allotment on that unit until it runs out or I don't wish to move it anymore. The other thing that can happen, though, is if I enter Fog of War. So if I was to enter Fog of War with this unit, post up on this wall, as soon as I enter that Fog of War, the card is flipped, so both sides know what it is, and the movement immediately ends. You cannot continue moving after revealing a terrain card from Fog of War. Not only that, but you have the option to move in place. So perhaps I moved into this road, and then I did a lateral movement. If this was to happen, I would remove this card, and I would replace it with the top card of the terrain deck. Similarly to revealing from Fog of War, that would also end my movement. Anytime you enter a new terrain card, you have to rotate your unit to face the direction they're entering the card. That is because facing is important in this game. You can always spend a single movement point to reorient your unit to face whatever direction you choose within a terrain card. That's about it for movement. I already covered how opportunity fire can happen, so let's get into how firing works. So, let's say this sentry squad here. So if this sentry squad was looking to fire on this assault squad, they would need to, considering it's not op fire, they would need to spend a 1 or a 2. So let's say they assign this 2, and they announce that they are firing on this assault squad. Now, the first thing that happens is we need to figure out line of sight. So let's actually, for the sake of line of sight, let's go have the target be over here. So, the way line of sight works, first off, there are no diagonals in Firefight Tactical, not for any purpose, including line of sight. And so when we are tracing line of sight, the way you do it is you imagine a box that has the firing unit on one corner and the target on the opposite corner. Then we look at the dimensions of that box. What is the longer side? In the case of this one, this is 2 by 3. Whatever is the longer side, you trace that direction first and then zigzag. So this is how the line of sight is drawn for this particular attack. If they're equidistant, in the case of this one, where it's 2 by 2, the firing unit player chooses which side they count first, which in this case they would choose to go with the road. In this particular example, the reason this is relevant is because Fog of War always counts as +1 terrain effect modifier hindering terrain. So, in the case of this sentry squad, they are having to deal with the +1 terrain effect modifier for this shot, because the road itself doesn't have any terrain effect modifier. So, having looked at that, we would then look at their firepower. They have a firepower of 8. The unit is in range as we count the line of sight. 1, 2, 3. So, less than or equal to 4, they're fine. And then they are going to roll 2 dice, and they are trying to get an 8 or lower. So they actually just made the shot. This is 7 plus 1 from the terrain effect modifier from the Fog of War is 8. So they just made the shot. Now that they have done that, the assault squad has to make a morale check. So in this case, it's a straight 7. And they succeeded, so they would be fine. However, a very important thing that will happen most fire checks in Firefight Tactical, let me just create this situation, is we have something called the fire attack success margin. So, if this had been rolled by the German sentry squad, +1 from the Fog of War, they would have ended up with a final result of 4, which is 4 less than their firepower. That means their fire attack success margin is 4, because they beat their firepower by 4. That then becomes the penalty on the morale check for this assault squad. So in that case, I would need to roll a 3 or lower in order to prevent becoming pinned with this assault squad. A global rule in Firefight Tactical, I should cover at this point, is that anytime you are adding up a series of modifiers for any roll, the modifier can never be greater than +4 or less than -4. It is always capped at that much. Now, the last thing I want to cover here around these rolls is doubles. So anytime you roll doubles in Firefight Tactical, something special happens. If you succeed and roll doubles, something great happens, and if you fail and roll doubles, something terrible happens. So, in the case of a fire check, if you as the firing player succeed and roll doubles, your target has to immediately become reduced. So this assault squad would have been replaced by a assault half squad, and then we would continue to resolve the fire check as normal. If the firing unit fails and rolls doubles, they become disrupted. So this counter would go underneath them, and a disrupted unit can be used. They can move, they can do everything except make any kind of aggression action, any kind of fire check, until during the cleanup step when dice come off, if the unit doesn't have a die on it, then that is them getting back into good order, and they can remove that counter and be able to aggress on other units again. For morale checks, it depends on whether it's a rally. Maybe I won't cover that right now, but the most exciting, in my opinion, thing that can happen is when on any kind of morale check you succeed and roll doubles. That's what's called a valor result. A valor not only results in the unit rallying or whatever they're trying to do for that morale check, but they can also immediately interrupt the other action and perform any action on their dice menu without assigning a die to them, even if they already have a die on them. So that is sudden, giant explosions of heroism where, they'll be under fire, and then all of a sudden they, dig deep, find courage, and either fire back, jump into melee. Any number of things can happen that way. So that's about how doubles go. On the subject of melee, I do want to cover that real quick, because I didn't mention stacking. Every terrain card can have at most 2 squads, friendly squads, in it. They can have any number of single-man counters in there, and they can have a single vehicle, but you're limited to 2 squads. The exception to that is melee. If you are able to move into a zone that contains an enemy unit, they are immediately considered to be locked in melee. No units in that terrain zone can have dice assigned to them for the remainder of the game turn, until at the end of the game turn we resolve the melee. The last standard action I would like to cover is take cover. So, let's say I was on this wall. So this wall has a +1 terrain effect modifier. So when a unit is firing into this assault squad is automatically benefiting from the +1 terrain effect modifier against the fire check. However, once that fire check has been passed by the firing player, and it's now my opportunity to try to pass my morale check, I don't benefit from this terrain effect modifier. However, if I was to take cover, I would take a counter, it's the flip side of the disrupted counter, and place this under my assault squad to represent that they are in cover. A unit that is in cover functions normally, except when they are making morale checks, they again benefit from the inverse of this terrain effect modifier. So I would be more likely to succeed at a morale check because we are in cover, dug in behind this wall. A unit remains in cover until they vacate the zone. So that's either if I was to leave it, this would be removed, or if I was to do even a lateral movement and replace this wall with the top card of the deck. Ooh, that's terrible. But now they would be stuck in this stream, and they are no longer in cover. So, the next one I actually do need to mention is rallying. So when a unit is pinned, you attempt to do the rally action. You simply do a morale check. You are trying to roll equal to or less than that morale value, and if you succeed, they return to good order, and you would be able to have access to the good side of the counter again with its more options on its action menu. Let's see. So that's about it for standard units. The next thing I want to cover is leaders. So leaders are very different. Leaders do not have a firepower or a range. Instead, they have a command range and a leadership value. So the leadership value will work as a modifier on anything that happens within their command range. So that would be rally checks, that would be fire checks. On top of that, though, they have a very different set of actions. And so I'm not going to get into all of these, but the big one I want to cover is coordinate, because it's so important and every leader has it. The different leaders have different action menus, but they all have coordinate. What coordinate does is if, let's say we have this fire squad and this recon squad stacked with our Sergeant Hardy over here, I can use coordinate with Sergeant Hardy. Let's take this 3. And I can either move or fire with every unit in that stack at the same time. If they fire together, we have a lead unit. In this case, it would definitely be the fire squad because they have the better fire profile. And then we increase their firepower by 1 for each other unit with a fire action that's in that space. So that can be potentially really powerful. But what it's more commonly used for is coordinated movement. When you move as a coordinated action, the entire stack moves together. So let's say we moved into this, and that ended our coordinated movement. What's so relevant about coordinate, and this works for the coordinated fire as well, is once we get there, Sergeant Hardy is the only unit in that zone that is spent by having a die on it. Even though the fire squad and the recon squad both moved with him, they are both still available to be ordered later in the game turn. So this is a really good economic way to order your units, get them where you need to get them, and then still have them available to either move further themselves or fire or whatever you intend to do with them. So that is about everything I wanted to cover for this rules overview. If you have any questions, please let me know. You can drop them in the comments section on this video, or you can leave it on the Firefight Tactical entry on Board Game Geek, and I'd be happy to answer. There's a lot of things I did not cover here. I didn't go into how melee works. I didn't go into how armor works. We didn't cover support weapons. We didn't cover concealment. But this is enough to get you started in the first scenario of the game, and also should give you a pretty good idea of how the game works. So anyway, if that sounded good to you, please consider picking up Firefight Tactical, and thank you again for your time.